On the T-Rex Talk podcast, we often talk about tyranny, we often talk about courage, we often talk about rights and responsibilities. And today we're going to look at how the federal government is kind of weaponizing the DOJ against, all of these things. Welcome to another T-Rex Talk. I have a guest that we have mentioned on the podcast several times, Paul Vaughn, who lives here in town. He's a neighbor, but he's never been on the podcast before. So, Paul Vaughn, welcome to the podcast. How long have we known each other for? Because we met before my family moved to Tennessee. It was early days of all kinds of businesses and ideas and.
Been a long time. I didn't know there was going to be a test. I would have studied, but
Well,
it was early days, so it's been a good decade and a half, or maybe two
at least. Yeah. So you were also an integral part of T-Rex when we were back in the holler making stuff on the microwave ovens. Our entire internet link was a tower tied to a tree that could see one of your towers.
Yep. Redneck Internet back in the day.
Yeah.
Hang it in a tree and get a signal out, and you can get internet anywhere in the world.
Yeah. So we can talk about the past. We can talk about those ubiquity links, and we actually talk about RF networks here on the T-Rex. Mostly on the T-Rex Labs channel more often, but. Yeah. The main thing that I want to talk about is your recent experiences. I thought this was topical because the Democratic National Convention is still happening in Chicago. Several people have mentioned that it's imperative that Trump be destroyed in the polls so that he doesn't weaponize the DOJ against people. And I believe that you're something of an expert in this particular field. We've talked about this a little bit in a previous podcast episode. We interviewed Kyle a couple of days before your first trial began. But if you want to back up even before that and talk about the raid,
sure,
that would be interesting, I think, to folks.
Yeah, we can do a synopsis and kind of bring it all together. So March of 21 was a ProLife event at an abortion clinic. And, my sum total of that day was being in the hallway in a public building, interfacing with the police officers mainly and talking with their negotiation team when they were on site. And talking about the civil magistrate's duties and protecting life and reporting a murder in progress, and we had some good conversations with the police chief and the lead negotiating team and stuff in the hall that day. But that was it. I prayed. I read sang hymns with the other folks there, and some folks were arrested for blocking a door, typical sit-in stuff. I was not. We left when the police told us to leave when the negotiation process had gone through. Mm-hmm. And, it was a good time. Babies were saved that day. The church was encouraged, and a little bit of news media to get the public conversation around abortion active in Middle Tennessee and Mount Juliet again. Mm-hmm. Mount Juliet had already had a lot of conversations. They tried to get the abortion clinic out. The abortion clinic came in deceptively.
Yes, yeah.
And there was a big lawsuit and things. So it was in that county, Wilson County out there, was already a big conversation, and this kind of helped spur that on. And that was it. Everybody goes home. The people that went to jail got a court date set for the local court, local county court, all which was eventually dismissed. And, 18 months later, we get this FBI open up 7 o'clock in the morning when I'm about to take my kids to school co-op. And, it's not something you process well.
Well, at least it wasn't 4 a.m. We've seen how some 4 a.m. raids go, but 7 a.m., knock on the door, and who all is there from the FBI? Like, how big of a group?
Yeah, it's a 4-man tactical team, full tactical gear, body armor, long guns, the whole spill. Velcro badges, the authoritative Velcro badge that it's the government. I must be safe.
Yeah,
and jokingly, the difference between the 4 a.m. raid and the 7 a.m. raid is there's daylight, and those people normally live. Mm-hmm. And there's been several fatalities over the last year during the course of this trial. From right here in Tennessee, a couple counties away, there was a raid where the FBI shot a guy, and and don't worry, they're investigating themselves, so we're sure everything is above board there.
It's on the to-do list right next to the Las Vegas shooter and stuff from previous decades. They'll get to it eventually, Yeah,
but we got the document files. We got Trump's documents from Mar-a-Lago. We're going through that first.
Priorities,
Yes, yeah. So anyway, but the 4 guys show up, and they're holding 3 of my kids in the yard. One of them has them held back at a long gun. He's not aiming it at them, but he's low ready, ready to usual tactical positions, right? And
Yeah.
they're prohibited from going back in the house, so they're detained. And, basically telling my kids I'm a bad guy and they're here to arrest daddy and that kind of stuff. Meanwhile, in the house, chaos ensues as the whole farmhouse rattles and my other daughters run around telling mom, FBI's here, they're here to arrest daddy. And, so I step out the door and said, well, the only way this ends well is with me in handcuffs.
Yeah.
And so I surrendered myself to them to
Yeah.
start the legal battle.
And there was no indication because, like as you said, local police didn't do anything. The incident is 18 months between
Yep.
the event and the raid. So
Sure.
nothing was on your radar.
Not at all. No, they never called. They never questioned. Mr. Ron would like to talk to you about this event.
Yeah.
They had plenty of opportunity to. As we talked about, I'm a business owner in the local community here. I've been here for decades.
Right.
And,
You have an office. You're always.
Yeah, I'm always there and available.
Yeah.
Everybody around here knows where to find me, including the sheriff and county commissioners that I interact with regularly. So,
Yeah.
So there was no reason for it other than they wanted a big news splash. They wanted to strike fear in the church and the people of God and the community at large. Right, it's what tyranny does. And so that's kind of the purpose there.
Now, there's another interesting bit of timing. Something had happened in the Supreme Court right before your event, which I don't think you had anything to do with. I don't believe that you have any connection to that at all. But there were a spate of these raids and prosecutions began right after a Supreme Court ruling.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So between March and the October raid the following year, 18 months later, not 6 months later, Dobbs was overturned. So abortion in America came down. There was no civil right to abortion.
No federally protected.
No federally protected right. Yeah. And of course, Biden, Kamala Harris, and Kristen Clark and Vanita Gupta had started the Reproductive Task Force to go after and prosecute FACE cases, which is interesting because FACE was all around abortion. That's the whole reason it was passed under the Clinton era. And that is what they decided to use to punish dissenting ideological views. And that's the only reason they did it. And, protect a woman's right to abortion that no longer was there. And so it was nothing more than a weaponization of the FBI, like we hear so much of today. But that's just the facts of what it was.
Yeah. So it's a fascinating thing, just the way that the timing of this stuff has played out, because there's a couple ways to say this politely. The conversation between the pro-life folks and the folks on the other side, we have decades of precedent and the way that the interactions work and legal precedent on how protests or obstructions, like this is all highly, widely discussed stuff. How long has the FACE Act been around? When was the FACE Act passed?
So it was 94, and you said we didn't have anything connected to the larger events that happened, but we have been involved in pro-life ministry, Beth and I, since before our wedding. We met doing sidewalk counseling, and so we were actually around when they were debating and negotiating the FACE Act.
Right.
And we attended rallies encouraging the church to stand up against it because it would be used, ironically, just like it was used against us as a weaponized law to go after pro-lifers.
Right. But in the 30 years that the FACE law has been in place, there actually haven't been that many cases brought. There haven't been that many prosecutions until a specific period of time.
Yep. Yeah, it's mainly after Dobbs. So after Roe and Dobbs were overturned, there's been a heightened prosecution of them. Now, they have been, and it has varied over the last couple decades. There have been spikes of activity.
Certain administrations, maybe?
Perhaps. We could go line them on the timeline and see where they all pan out. I've not tracked with it very well. And you got to remember, Isaac, this goes back to a very proactive, a very active church activity at the abortion mills.
Yes, yeah.
And they were being very effective, and there were abortion mills closing down because the church would just go out, stand out on the property, not allow them to kill children. And so it was one of the most productive means of civic protest, if you will, of actually changing an unjust federal law, which is what the American populace is that's the whole design of our Constitution is a check and balance against federal overreach and tyranny, and it was being effective in that.
Yeah.
And so they needed the federal law. They need a stronger hammer, if you will, to beat that back and to allow abortion to continue.
Yeah. Well, and I think there was a very strong retributive element to it as well. After Dobbs, the Dobbs decision was handed down, there was a flurry of, anger at Donald Trump because this is all his fault. Donald Trump must be punished. What are some other people that we can go and punish?
Sure.
What are some cases that might be open or able to be opened? So
yeah, it's funny you mentioned them talking about weaponization of the FBI and stuff. When we come back, there's a great quote this week at the DNC where they're talking about that, and that's not the way Donald Trump's going to weaponize the FBI and go after his political advocates. That's not the way it works in America. And I'm like, I protest. I think that is the way it is working in America, and it shouldn't be.
There are something like 1,000 January 6 folks, and one of the promises at the DNC was like, we'll stop Donald Trump from weaponizing the DOJ, and we're going to hunt down more January 6ers from 3
we'll weaponize it
years
more.
ago. Yeah. So it's a fascinating, inconsistencies there to point out.
There's a great quote there as well, just that ties into that from Kamala Harris from the 2020 campaign in New Hampshire at a speech there, where she talks about the quote is, "With a swipe of my pen, I realized that I could charge someone even with the smallest offense. They would be arrested, they could be put in jail for 48 hours, and their life could be changed. They'd have to spend money on lawyers. They'd be forever changed. And I could dismiss the charges a week later. But that impact is done." And so out of their own mouth, and she meant it, and eventually turned it to, this is what Donald Trump is going to do, and he didn't recognize the power that he has, but I recognize the power.
As a former prosecutor and attorney general.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So I just, watching these events in the DNC this week have really been great for my piety and learning grace and humility.
Yes, yeah. Well, so it was the beginning of the trial. We did a podcast episode and talked about that the trial was going to begin, what the charges were, what the expected or maximum penalties were. Right. But you're here now, so obviously the trial is over, because there was a while there when your lawyers didn't want you to talk to that many people.
Sure.
Say that much stuff.
Yeah. So, we faced up to 11 years. Face would carry a maximum of a year, 6 months for a nonviolent offense, which obviously ours was. And then the catch there, which is one of the things that's before the appeals court now, is the federal conspiracy law. The 241 versus the 271 conspiracy, or two different conspiracy options they have. And anyway, so that brought the 10-year charge to us. So it made what was a misdemeanor in actions that I did not actually do, by the way. It was the conspiracy, because I agreed ideologically with the other folks that they can say, well, he committed face by conspiring, not by action.
Yeah.
And so that was what we faced. But it's amazing the testimony, the letters that were written from around this nation, and the prayers from around the world. It was just an amazing event that got orchestrated. The media exposure and the things that happened just was off the chart. Nothing I could ever take credit for, thankfully. It's just neat to see how divine providence works and how things work out. So the letter campaign to the judge, people writing on our behalf, talking about our character. And when you got your state senator and your state representative writing, talking about your character and your need and your business in the community, when you got your pastor talking about your moral character and the upstanding quality and character qualities of the persons involved, and the judge looks at all this, and of course the letters from family and friends and everything else, and the judge looks at this and says, well, I don't think I want to be the person putting those kind of people in jail.
Right. And you got some attention from bigger, more powerful people. Like, I have tremendous respect for everybody that you just mentioned. I don't know that federal judges necessarily have as much respect for some of the Centerville folks, but you got some attention nationally, and you had some opportunity to talk to bigger podcasters than T-Rex Arms. Yeah.
I mean, it was amazing. Just a flurry from Tucker Carlson to Matt Walsh, Blaze TV, more than I could have ever arranged or planned or plotted. It was just really neat to see those open up. And as people heard the story and realized what was actually going on, it just really is a good snapshot picture of our culture. And I think that really connected with people in a way that they understood. The January 6th can be hard because there were people beating on things. There were people in
absolutely.
the crowd that were violent. There were things
There were
going on
instigators.
there.
There were people outside.
A good storyteller can take a picture of anything at January 6th and make the narrative whatever they want because there's a lot there. But the pictures of me sitting in the hallway with my Bible praying and reading, and the pictures of them in full tactical gear in my house just didn't. It wasn't consonant.
Yeah,
and I think that helped the story.
Do you think if you hadn't gotten some attention from Matt Walsh and Tucker Carlson and others, that the sentencing would have been different? Because you were found guilty of conspiracy. Like, you absolutely conspired to tell people what you believed.
Yes, I did. I am guilty.
That's what I recall. I have heard you mention this before. So
sure.
So you were found guilty of conspiracy to agree with opinions of other people. I forget exactly how it was worded, but
yeah, I did. The conspiracies, the whole thing is our justice system is a joke. And I think hopefully that's one thing this all brings out as well, is we need judicial reform. Usually it's the far left calling for judicial reform and
packing the courts.
Right. Yeah. And but there is a need. There are things wrong. I don't think packing the court's the answer. I think it goes much deeper than that. It goes back to the moral character of every individual listening to us today and every individual across the country. We saw that play out in the court with the jury, with the judges, with the prosecution. Everybody has something that drives them.
Yeah.
And the absence of absolute values and virtues in our culture allows for a certain moral flexibility that allows these kind of tyrannical acts to take place.
And the tribalism that comes out, like it's, I'm sure it's difficult for some people to take a stand and look at the merits of the case when they've already been told that you're on the other side of this two-sided battle for democracy and against fascism and blah, 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 blah. Like, there are two sides. Yeah. There is no looking at the facts and figuring out what happened. You're already on the wrong side.
Yep. And then the whole system of evidence. So basically the rules of evidence, what that allows the prosecution to do is basically shape the case to get to the verdict they want, right? So this case said we can only present these types of evidence. So basically there were 4, 5, 6 things, and I don't even remember them all. They were so numerous and so detailed, but the big ones were there can be no evidence that might lead to jury nullification. Right. Jury nullification is a big check and balance, right? Core fundamental issue with our government system. Yeah. And so they did not allow any evidence that might lead the jury to consider nullification. Yeah. There could be no evidence that spoke or claimed First Amendment privileges. The judge ruled that, the FACE Act already considered the First Amendment actions and protected those by its structure. Now, what she did not say is, did the conspiracy also do that? Because it did not. And so, right? Yeah. And so out of a 20-minute interview I did on the media, which was one of the primary pieces of evidence used against me, there were 7 words allowed out of that 20-minute interview. We could not play any of the rest of it. Okay. Even though in the interview, I rebutted the phrase they wanted to use to hang me with several times and brought it and interpreted it and defined it in that interview. Right. And so to say that I was guilty is really a stretch in the true sense of justice. I was not guilty of any of it. I did not block doors. I did not intimidate anyone, right? But I did not in the true
conspiracy sense, includes having an opinion.
Apparently it does. But see, that's the thing is, does conspiracy include 2 or 5 or 10 people sitting in a dark room planning and plotting? Or does it just mean that they show up at the same event with the same ideological motive? Right, yeah. And then things happen, and whatever the worst common thing that happens is everyone's guilty of. Yeah. Right?
So I think that definition you described is really attractive to people. Because we're doing it right now. We're sitting in a dark room right now. Thousands of people will watch this interview. Right. Their opinions will be shaped. And a grand conspiracy can be traced back to, this conversation.
Yeah, so I'm conspiring to be clear, to make sure I say it properly on tape. My conspiracy here is America, repent. Yes. America, humble yourself. That is what I'm conspiring to say these days.
Yeah. When there is this this moral flexibility that is sort of built on tribalism, obviously that has clear, obvious danger to it. But this idea that I've been thinking about this a lot regarding firearm law recently, but when
Sure.
you take something, and firearm law is great because it's about physical objects that can be weighed, that can be measured, like chamber pressures and barrel lengths, like these things are quantifiable. But when you write rules that are guns can't be too powerful, guns can't be too long, guns
Yeah.
can't be too readily convertible, and there's no definitions around them, it leaves room for huge expansions of things. And
Yeah.
when conspiracy is defined as anything up to and including conversating,
Sure.
which is a
Yeah.
word that I hate, but it's a great podcasting word. We're conversating about opinions. Like that is
Yeah.
the new definition of conspiracy. That is a new thing. And even just these constructive charges where you needed, if my understanding is correct, you needed to be guilty of the misdemeanor in order for you to have conspired to do anything. But you needed to have conspired to do anything for the misdemeanor to actually have enough to go to court with.
Sure. Yeah. It was very circular.
Yeah.
And here's the other thing that just blew me away. I mean, you were talking about the words and things, and I think it was Lee, maybe that said, or maybe Jefferson Davis, I think probably was, that gets credit for the quote. But the tax.
Already, if you quote either of the two gentlemen you just mentioned,
Right, yeah.
it's already verboten.
Oh, we're done,
Go
yes,
on.
yeah.
The First Amendment doesn't apply to things that we've decided that we don't like. But
Exactly.
carry on.
Yes. But he said attacks on great cultures come first from the denigration of language.
Yes.
And we saw that in the courtroom, and I was shocked. One of the biggest things that set me back in the whole trial, the whole event, everything, ranking right up there next to the FBI knock on the door, was that they did not have a definition for the word obstruct. And
okay.
what does it mean to obstruct?
Yeah.
And because there's two different, in both the conspiracy law and the face law, there were two different definitions. And
Right.
and so there was, and one of them doesn't even have, the conspiracy law doesn't have one component of the face law. So they're trying to say that we conspired to do this, but this is not listed in the conspiracy law. So we had minutes, long conversations, rest, going back and considering it, ruling on it the next day,
Right.
of the actual terms of what they showed up in my door and arrested me for. They hadn't even defined what I had done wrong when they
Yes.
arrested me, and they're working it out in the court as they go.
Yeah.
And that was just beyond my understanding of good moral justice that we would expect from
Yeah.
a moral and righteous nation.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, it's a fascinating situation that we find ourselves in. What would you say to young, the T-Rex podcast listeners are a little bit on the younger side. So they have maybe less history of how things were. They have a lot more years in the current nation, in the current system.
Sure.
What advice would you give them as they think about this? One thing that I think was really amazing is the fact that you were bold and uncompromising gave you an opportunity to do more good throughout the trial, the sentencing, and afterwards than you probably could have done if you just played it safe.
Sure.
But you're also a father. You have kids and grandkids in the community. And how do you weigh all of these things? And how would you like my generation or the next generation to weigh all of these things in this struggle where they have fewer legal protections, fewer definitions to stand on,
Right.
and more to fight against?
Yep. I can't remember the quote that I would start with, but basically, if you don't have something firm to stand on, you'll fall for anything.
Yes.
Right, is loosely quoted by somewhere. Right, the principle is there. I think the thing I was referencing earlier with the jury and the judge and prosecution and our lack of character will be the number one thing I would encourage people to study and embrace, understand the core virtues like courage, like humility, things of this nature, fortitude. And we don't train those. So the education system throughout world history started with core, what became encapsulated in Christian virtues, even though Aristotle recognized them as a created element of society before Christ ever came along. But if we don't have moral fortitude, right, if we don't know where we're going to stand, when the FBI knocks at your door, you won't know what you're doing. You won't have a guideline and the boundaries basically to know what to stand. And I'll give an example that would be relevant to gun owners. Out of the 4 agents that showed up at my door, there was one particular agent that was cocky and arrogant. It was nervous. He was amped up on adrenaline. He had no business on the backside of a weapon in a dangerous situation. These would be the guys that no one would dare go in a foxhole with in war. Right? This guy had no capacity to restrain himself. And that's dangerous. People could have died that day. One of my children could have been killed because of his lack of moral character.
Right.
And when I say character, I don't mean he doesn't smoke, doesn't cuss, doesn't drink. What I mean is he has the internal fortitude to know where he stands and to stand there regardless of the circumstances.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's the key. And if we want to change and shape a culture, we start first with us.
Yes.
And we build strong personal boundaries and strong moral pathways that we can operate on, and then that overflows out into the culture.
Yeah. On that note, I noticed that you didn't take a plea deal.
Sure.
I'm sure you were offered one.
Yes.
So speaking of courage and fortitude, I think that there's probably, we don't want to go too deep into the can of worms of when it's right to do that and when it's right to not. But that's a good example of, I think a lot of people expected you to take the plea deal because 90+% of federal prosecutions go that way.
Yep. And that's exactly why I didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, here's the truth is, it was an honor to be in a trial with these other folks that I conspired with, right? These folks that I ideologically agreed with. I respect them.
Yeah.
And every one of them, to the man, to the woman, said, no, we didn't do those things. What we did was justified because they were killing babies, and you got to stay to the narrative. And what the plea deal does is it blocks the narrative from ever coming into the courtroom, so true justice can never be done. And like you said, 90% of the cases get pled out. And then the thing that strikes fear, and when you're trying to be courageous, when you look at the other 10% that go to trial, there's still an 87% conviction rate because of the rules of evidence and everything else. That right there, just those numbers should tell us where we are as far as justice in our system, right?
Yeah.
If you're telling me that only 7% or whatever that is, 13% cases are actually not guilty that are brought, that's a number right there, I think, that would disprove, the idea of justice.
Yeah.
But yeah, we stood on just moral principle that I literally did not break face. The other guys, it's questionable whether sitting at the door was breaking face or not, and that's something that's being litigated post-Roe, and whether the FACE Act stands, and that's another whole question.
Right. Yeah.
But just on principle, morally, my guide rails are, well, I didn't do it, so I can't lie and say I'm not pleading to something that I didn't do.
Yeah.
Right? It's just basic.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Well, that's very inconvenient because you had to have broken the FACE Act for the conspiracy charges to stick, and the conspiracy charges had to stick for there to be any real significant consequences. Now, speaking of consequences, you were found guilty based on the limited scope of evidence that was available, and jury nullification and First Amendment stuff taken completely off the table. Why did you not, do you think, or is this something that you can't talk about till after the appeal process? Why do you think you didn't get the full 11 years? Is it the letters from local community? Is it the pressure from Matt Walsh, currently undercover at the DNC right now in his fake ponytail? Like, what do you think was the reason that you didn't get the whole book thrown at you? Because the other statistic, when you refuse the plea deal, you generally get the whole book thrown at you for the audacity to refuse the plea deal.
Well, I can confirm that it's not Matt Walsh's man bun, so that didn't impact it. I mean, the base answer, Isaac, is it was the providence of God. It was the prayers of people around the world, because it was not something you see in any case.
Right.
All right. There was no logical, material, reasonable expectation to get house arrest and to get whatever post-trial release, whatever we're on, not probation, but early release. Just other rules for the government intrusion into our home. And so, ultimately it was just a sovereign hand of God that did that. Now, what he used in that, the prayers, we've prayed every Monday night since the arrest.
Yes.
All right, we've had prayer for the defendants, and people have joined us around the nation, around the world.
People singing on the square right down here.
Yep.
Yes.
And we've gone out to the federal courthouse every first Saturday of every month since then. So throughout the year,
it's where one of the podcasts was recorded.
Exactly
yes.
right. Yeah. Yep. And so we understood this for the spiritual battle that it was, that it wasn't just material. It wasn't just all politics and stuff in this material world, but there is a spiritual aspect to child sacrifice, demonic influences and things of that nature. And we took that seriously. And I think we saw the fruit of those prayers because we prayed for the judge, not against the judge, but we prayed for the judge. We prayed for the prosecution. We prayed for Carolyn Davis. It turned against us. All right. And the prayer is, God, do what it takes in their life, either, save them or remove them. All right. Do what you want to do, but don't let it be stagnant. Don't let anybody come out of this trial not being impacted by what's happening in the spirit realm of things here. So I think that's a big part of it is spiritual. Now, but we can't overlook the material working out of the spiritual, and people did write letters. People did talk about it. Yeah. There was media coverage. There was public discourse and discussion around it. And so I think all that comes together to work out what God sovereignly wants to happen in the world. And sovereignly, he wanted me at home instead of in jail, and we're thankful for that.
Absolutely.
And, and we were willing to go to jail. And that's ultimately what you have to be willing to look 10 years in the eye and take it and say, is this truth worth standing for? And are you willing to take that risk? And I'm thankful, like I said, to be part of a group of people that have that kind of conviction and that kind of courage. And it was a blessing to be part of that.
Well, and it's I don't know if it's a growing group of people, but your trial was concluded months ago, but there are convictions still being handled down. Yesterday, 2 days ago, there was one. There are still a bunch of people who are going through this process. The process is kind of the punishment, but who are some of the others? What are some of the other cases that are happening?
Yeah, so they just finished 2 cases in Michigan. They were tried simultaneously because 2 of the defendants were in both events.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Okay, so Heather Idoni, who's been in jail from the D.C. rescue for over a year now, she's been locked up unjustly for the same.
Is she a flight risk? What's the?
She's a grandmother, has 10 kids.
Obviously,
old book owner, bookstore owner.
Yeah.
She did missionary work in Ukraine and sent medical aid packages.
That's why she's a flight risk, I guess. Yeah.
I guess because she could go to the front in Ukraine. I don't know.
Wow.
But she's locked up because it's an interesting turn of events in the D.C. case. One of the clinic workers, one of the pro-abortion folks, came out and started beating the pro-lifers with a broom. She consequently slipped and twisted her ankle. Therefore, there was injury, and therefore there was violence.
Everything ratchets up a few
because
notches,
there was violence, face becomes from 6 months to a year. And apparently the rules of the courtroom is if you're convicted of a violent crime, then you are remanded straight to jail.
Interesting. Well, we're not convicted. She hasn't been convicted yet, has she?
Heather in D.C.
Oh, okay. She was convicted in D.C. Gotcha.
Yeah, this was all of the D.C. case, which is different than Nashville, different than Michigan, right?
Yeah.
So 3 different cases going on. All the appeals working their way through the systems now from D.C. They can't appeal in Michigan until their sentencing, which hasn't been set yet, as I understand it.
Okay, yeah.
But they were all found guilty, and a very similar peaceful sit-in at the doors. Very, very similar case as the one in Nashville.
Yeah.
So,
well, it's interesting. So one of the things that gets talked about a lot in the firearm community, we believe that firearm ownership, the Second Amendment, clarifies and establishes, or rather clarifies and recognizes a pre-existing God-given right to self-defense. That's why the Second Amendment exists. It isn't the government benevolently granting us a temporary right to own a specific piece of hardware.
Sure.
But it recognizes a right that the government cannot touch and cannot take away. And there's a lot of folks in the gun industry who have really grabbed a hold of that as a core principle, and rightly so. And so the question often comes up, like, when do you resist? How do you resist? Because the nice thing about the Second Amendment is you resist the taking away of a thing that's really useful for resistance. Right. So the assumption is that you immediately resist with that Second Amendment item. as opposed to various other steps along the way to bring about,
Right.
start to bring some of those checks and balances into play. And that is happening. There's lawsuits against the federal government now, against the ATF that are ongoing, and there's been a lot of legal victory in that space.
Yep.
But this is a really fascinating thing. I know a lot of people who have this very flawed idea that I will sit at home with my guns until the red line is the red line is upon us. The blue helmets show up in my actual front yard. That's the red line. And then the first response to tyranny is the last resort.
Sure.
And there's a quote from one of the guys up in Moscow, Idaho. I'm sure it's not his own. I'm sure it's an old quote, but courage is a muscle. And I know a lot of people who assume that they will be courageous at the red line, even though they've never tested their courage muscles. They've never worked them out. They've never actually trained their courage.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what I was talking about, the virtues, right? So you do train that courage. And if you're not standing in the little things and exercising that muscle, as you said, then when that red line comes, you won't know what to do, and you won't stand, and you'll be highly disappointed in your own self because you didn't take the opportunity to exercise it along the way. And I think, Isaac, as an example, they did show up at my door.
Right.
That red line was crossed. I have weapons, right? Or at least I previously had I'm a citizen that formerly had the right to weapons that I will be fighting to get back, which is another topic we can talk about. But had I gone armed in this endeavor, we wouldn't be having the conversation today.
Right.
Right. Even if, best case scenario, I outshot 4 federal agents. We can assume are highly trained, although I think that might be questionable in today's world.
Yeah.
But even so, it's 4-1, and it's just a bad armed conflict to start with, right? And so there is no winning that physical battle, that gun battle in that scenario, right? But recognizing that we are in lawfare in our nation, and this is the stage of the tyranny that we're at, there is still hope in the courts, even though there's a lot of mischief and a lot of wickedness in the courts. There's still the opportunity. And so I take the position that every opportunity we have that's nonviolent to go and fight in the legal sphere, that's where the battle is fought today. That's where it is today.
Yes, yeah.
And then there's the whole issue of individual versus a lesser magistrate, a sheriff, or a governor standing against the federal governor, and how that plays into a nation and how nations overthrow tyranny.
Yeah. That's one that we need to get back to. It's a concept that was well understood in the past. Yeah. It's dimly understood now because a lot of people have forgotten that in 1776, it was not random yokels versus the cops. Right. It was the colonial elected officials. It was the lesser magistrates of the officials resisting Parliament and the king.
Sure.
These guys were not just random dudes. These were the guys who had been the governors and the legislators and the sheriffs and the generals of the colonial forces for a long time. It was the local government.
Yeah, and in short, they were exercising that nonviolent warfare in law, in politics.
For years.
Right?
Yes,
they
for
were
decades.
passing laws, they were petitioning, they were doing all the things nonviolently, and only when it became evident that this is not going to work did they pull back to force and lethal force and the taking of human life, because we value human life. And people think that's inconsistent for a pro-lifer to say that it might be right to use lethal force. But look, if you love your family and somebody's attacking your family, at some point you have to make a decision. Do you love that attacker more than your family? Your God-given duty is to protect your family, obviously. And so there's a place for violence in love.
And what's most loving for that attacker? To allow him to commit murder or to stop him, prevent him from taking that on himself. Yeah.
Sure. Yep.
Yeah. So we talk a lot throughout history about the ballot box, the jury box, and the cartridge box. There are some people, I don't know where they get this idea, because I've been watching CNN. I don't understand why they would be skeptical of the ballot box. I hear that it's well fortified. This current election that's coming, well fortified election.
It's the safest election ever this year.
Yeah. So for people who may have doubts about the ballot box. They hear about cases where juries are not allowed to consider nullification, not allowed to think about specific, really high-level parts of the Bill of Rights,
Right.
First Amendment stuff.
Yeah.
And they start to lose faith in the jury box. This is there's one more box that comes to mind, but you think we're still fighting things out in the lawfare realm, in the public opinion realm, in the cultural realm?
Sure. Absolutely. You have to recognize the spiritual aspect of this.
Yes.
Right? And there is an element and that's what provides hope. When everything else looks hopeless, there's hope in the supernatural and a God that created us, that loves his creation, and that is actually superintending the events that happen on this earth. So he's part of what's going on here. And not just part of it, he is the ultimate cause of everything that's going on. And so my take, and at least one take on it is, maybe the injustices in the court system are so that someone like me and others that are in the court, the January Sixers, there's several other folks. There's 40 military chaplains that are still in lawfare with the DOJ from COVID. That's still going on today, that we talked to this last week. That he puts us in those opportunities to see and give us the opportunity to recognize that it's a spiritual battle, to engage in prayer and fasting and these spiritual disciplines that we've largely gone soft on as a nation.
Yeah.
And so he provides us this opportunity to re-engage at the spiritual level, and then to see him divinely work in the material realm. And the fact that I'm sitting here and not in jail is evidence of that grace that we can see in those battles. So we shouldn't give up hope and immediately resort to the cartridge box.
Yeah.
We step in and engage and trust that duty is ours, right? Another great Southern quote, the results are God's.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, where God has us. And this is a great opportunity to be able to see that play out in our nation.
Yeah. And I agree with you completely that the spiritual and the material are inextricably linked.
Sure.
But the jury box and the ballot box, like, these are not single front wars. There are local elections, state elections.
Right.
The reason that I believe it was so important to drag you into federal court was because that was the place where a conviction was likely. I think that the rules would have been very different in lower courts because I will admit to some level of skepticism, like just between us, some level of skepticism when it comes to counting some ballots for an upcoming election.
Yeah.
But I think that like commissioners that we know that we have voted for, sheriffs that we know that we have voted for, judges that we see on a regular basis that we have voted for, like, I think that there's a huge amount of places where we can't be as pessimistic or as fatalistic as in the federal sphere. And there's a lot of battles to be done there, a lot of courageous muscle training to be done.
Yeah.
And then hopefully the lawfare continues and those local resources and those state resources come more into play in restraining the federal government as was designed. Because we don't have a whole lot of control over federal appeals court, but there is a tremendous amount of influence that people can have in their own communities to encourage and to sustain.
Well, it makes those local elections all the more important when you consider that you're electing representatives that will be deciding whether you go to war against a federal tyranny or not, right?
Yeah.
So if you're looking and judging that same character trait in those that you're voting for, one of the very first admonitions when Moses was dividing up the judicial system, as it were, was just like men among you that did not take a bribe.
Yes.
Now look at Washington, D.C., and tell me, out of 435 folks there, how many of them do not take money for a purpose in their careers, right? Every one of them, by the nature of our system, is taking money. And we might say, well, he's taking money from a cause I believe in and supporting that cause, therefore it's okay. But that's a different discussion, right?
Right, yeah.
The very fact that we are buying our politicians is a non-starter that we have to figure out how to solve. And so when you're talking at the local level, when you're talking at the state level, at your district levels or whatever, find those men. Find those folks that will stand and that won't be swayed by taking the money they need to run their office and do their thing, right? They can take the money and use it. But if they're, again, back to the virtues, if they're susceptible to avarice and greed and power, then they're not the person.
Yeah.
Right?
Try
Find
them
somebody
out.
else.
Try them out on the city council.
Right. Yeah, work their way up.
Yeah.
Try them out with a $100 bill before they get $1 million check.
Yeah. Yeah. So. Well, I did see somebody suggest a solution to that. They're like, oh, this campaign finance stuff. Let's fix it. Let's let the government itself pay for all the campaign finance stuff. Let the bureaucrats decide who gets the money to get elected. Like, yeah,
that'll work great.
I don't see a downside to that. Now that you mention it, yeah, seems perfect.
They just print more money for their campaign. Is that it?
I mean, there's no flaws, no holes in this thing. I can't find a downside. Well, so as you're moving forwards, you have your appeal process. Has the appeal been filed, and now it's a sort of a waiting game?
The appeal's filed. I just read over last night the full compilation, if you will, of a motion to stay our sentencing. So the very last thing we asked the district court to do was stay the sentencing pending the appeal. They rejected it. So the very first thing we did in the appeals court is pray for them to stay the appeal or stay the motion, the sentencing pending the appeal.
Okay, yeah.
And so, Thomas More Society has been great. By the way, I should plug them and recommend people support them at every opportunity. They're at the forefront of this battle on First Amendment opportunities and religious freedom around the nation. Steve Crampton is my lawyer that's been with me from the beginning. I think a divine appointment all the way around. It's been great. So he filed the motion to stay. The government responded to it, and he files the rebuttal, and now it's before the court. 3 judges will pick it up and look at it, or 1 will, or whatever.
It's a lot of process stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's been, 6 weeks, whatever it's been. It was filed in July 30th, I think. So wherever we're at, a few weeks anyway. But so that's where that is. And then once that is decided, basically the same kind of process will take place on the appeals. And, there are multiple pieces of it, most of which we've covered at some point in time in our conversation about the injustices and the things that are going on and how it's been used. The conspiracy charge was brought up by Patel, Sanjay Patel, as a lawyer at the DOJ. They wrote an article, it would have been in the first quarter of 22. So, or actually been second, it would have been right after Roe, right after the Dobbs decision. And so he published in the DOJ Quarterly this novel idea of how we can go after these pro-lifers and using that conspiracy to make it a 10-year felony. And so he wrote an article about this. Yeah. And then you have
lo and behold.
Yeah. Then you have the Reproductive Task Force that comes along and says, we're going to protect and prosecute face cases. And so he wrote the playbook, and that's the playbook they've been running, knowing, in my view, that the process is the punishment. They know this is going to get smacked down. They know it's an illegal use of law. And that's something we haven't, take this phrase, lawful use of the law is something foreign to our construct. But they know it's an illegal use of the law and that it will be shut down. But in the meantime, just like Kamala said, with the swipe of her pen, right, we've been going through this since October 22 now. And the battle we're still several years out, probably from having it ultimately refined, and that's just this phase. And then we have the offensive phase. Right. Because once it's overturned, then what do we do with all our rights that were violated? What do we do to discipline them so they don't go do this to somebody else? Precisely. And that's the countersuit, and they're highly narrow view of rules and things that you can do to actually punish the government for their wrongful actions. But there are some, thankfully, in our Constitution and our laws that we can use, and that's that'll be another several years in the making after that. Yep. Yeah.
Well, courage is a muscle, but it isn't just strength that's required. It's endurance. It's sounds like a very long process. So in many ways, I would say that you've had the best possible outcome based on the charges that you could have received. You're 2 years into pretty miserable circumstances, and to finish well, you're going to have multiple years of some pretty miserable circumstances going forwards.
Sure. Yep. I mean, even house arrest, requires an invasion of privacy as they come in and inspect your house. Regular now, thankfully we don't have an ankle bracelet. We're not right. They're
Now, other members
right.
of your community have.
Others do.
Yeah.
Ironically, in our case, there were 4 misdemeanors that were only charged with face. We didn't kind of divide that up. 6 charged with the conspiracy, 4 just with the face charges, and those 4 got hammered harder than the majority of the 6 in the felony case.
Interesting.
So just the application, the process is the punishment piece, right? So their ankle bracelet, drug testing every month, and just all kinds of different nuances of just, again, house visits monthly, just making the process painful.
Yes.
And discouraging others from looking into their tyranny.
Right. Yeah. And you're a felon now, so you have certain rights that are no longer available to you, and you're going to fight to get those back.
Yep.
But it's going to be an endurance test for sure.
You bet.
Yeah.
Yep. That's the way it works. But you just got to take it day by day and trust God is doing what He's doing. And again, it's all an opportunity to exercise that muscle, or other muscles. Right? There's plenty of virtue muscles to be exercised, not just courage.
It's true.
And piety and humility is another one that gets exercised quite frequently in this process too.
Yeah. So let's end with this. Why go through with that much trouble? You could have just started a podcast, sat in a comfortable room, never conspired with anybody, and just waited until the podcast in itself was the crime. That would have given you probably 15 comfortable years as opposed to the 10 uncomfortable years that you're 2 years into now.
Sure.
Why go out and do the work?
Because there's work to be done, and that is our job. Like I said earlier, my wife and I and our children, we've been engaged in the pro-life work for a long time. And to say pro-life is actually falling prey to their narrative. There are babies dying daily. There are actual human beings. First Amendment, very basic, first fundamental right to life is being violated. And if we believe that's true, and we believe that we have a duty to rescue those being led to slaughter, then it's not enough just to sit back and talk about it. At some point, you actually have to go out and do something. And that's basically all we're trying to do. We spent years sidewalk counseling and doing other things that were not as forceful, if you will, as the FACE Act. As people
and
rescuing.
Conspiring,
And which, in all honesty, that's what I was participating in that day, was sidewalk counseling. That's what we were doing. That's what our minister did, Personhood Tennessee. That's who we are. And but we were doing something, right? And we were going to where the battle intersects, which is at the doors of the gates of hell, if you will, Planned Parenthood or Carafum, where little boys and girls are being slaughtered in this case. And there are lots of other flashpoints of battles, of different battles that are just as worthy of fighting in our nation. But like those that went to the doors of the state capitol on January 6th, right? There was corruption and things going on, and they went to confront it. 99% of them went peacefully and nonviolently to confront it, but they were swept into a broader narrative that is, we have to discern and work through.
Well, and this is important work on so many different levels, because I was joking earlier about the podcasts are fine for at least another 10 years.
Right.
That's only here.
Maybe.
In the UK,
right.
Mean tweets will get you 10 years.
Yeah.
So these are freedoms that we have as long as we maintain them.
Go back to, we have history that we can look at. Recent history is as late as the 80s in Romania, but under communist Russia and Solzhenitsyn's writings. If you haven't read Solzhenitsyn, go and just and imbibe what he said. Basically, the phrase is it's a tenor, right? Everybody gets a tenor. If you talk to the wrong person yesterday and I'm seen talking to you on the street and on the town square today, I can be picked up and thrown in the gulag for 10 years without question. Nobody knows where I went, what happened.
Right. Yeah.
They were accustomed to people disappearing off the streets, not seeing them for 10 years, and then they show back up if they live. And that, that's the height of injustice, it's the height of tyranny. But this is not new in the world.
Right.
It's ebbs and flows, and we see it throughout history. And we need to not delude ourselves and think that it's not, and just prepare for it and understand it so we can stand.
Yeah. A king or an emperor or a party that is allowed to just inflict horrible punishments on people at whim and those punishments will be arbitrarily and unevenly applied, creates a mindset among the people that it utterly atrophies the courage and the other virtues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would, one last thought, Isaac, I'm just thinking about this as we're looking, is you want a picture of what moral caving does, right? If you don't exercise those muscles and don't have the virtues in yourself, Joe Biden is a perfect picture of what a lifetime of a man selling out looks like.
Yes.
And if you want to end up your life, put yourself in it's hard to have compassion on the man, but put yourself in his shoes and look at that and imagine yourself ending your life like he's ending his life, and ask yourself, is that the path that I want to go down? Is that what I want when I'm done with my days? To have sold out so much that I'm so far from my moral self, so far from the human I was created to be, that I can't even recognize myself.
Yeah. He's turned his back on all the things that he stood for in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s.
Yep.
And look at who he's being celebrated by. That's also embarrassing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for the work that you have done and the work that you're continuing to do. It is pretty multifaceted stuff. Everything from community support, sidewalk ministry, it all is kind of coming to, feels like it's coming to a head in some ways. It feels like you're just continuing the logical extension of what's next in other ways. So,
Sure. Yep. One step at a time.
yeah. Well, is there anything that we should recommend? There's a more detailed podcast, the Stifled Cry, that talks about some of these things.
Sure.
We plugged it last time we talked about this issue, so I'll plug it again. And anything else we should mention?
Sure. I mean, I'm writing about it. I'm hoping.
Oh yeah, your
Lord willing,
Substack. I'll link to your Substack. Yeah.
We'll do a book or something at some point. We're tossing around the ideas of what that might look like, or how do you frame the story? There's 1,000 stories in this story, right? That are worthy of being told. But yeah, paultn.substack.com. You can find more information there. And it's an occasional writing at this point as we try to get things down.
Yeah.
There are more drafts than published articles, but more to come.
I know the feeling. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Not just for coming in to be part of the podcast, but you've been doing the work for 20 years that I have basically watched with my own eyes. So I'm confident in the next 20, and would recommend that viewers, listeners, get out and do the work. We've said it a bunch of times, but I think we're just going to have to keep saying it for a while.
Put your hand to the plow and don't look back.
Thanks very much for listening to this podcast. And now that we are branching out, we have it on YouTube and Spotify and a couple of other platforms. Let us know either in the comments down below or by emailing us team@trex-arms.com and letting us know what you thought. Not just of this episode, but what you would like to see next. I know that there's going to be some controversy around this one. There's a lot of people who disagree on whether being anti-abortion and being pro-gun even fits together. But I think that Paul Vaughn made a great case for why the protection of life, liberty, and our rights is a thing that crosses a bunch of these different political tribes, and that the responsibilities that we all have and that we all need to carry. So keep us posted on the things that you are interested in thinking about and would like to hear more about, and we will keep you posted on the things that we are doing.